Manuel Quezon once said, "I prefer a government run like hell by Filipinos than a government run like heaven by Americans." And that is where people usually stop, and start blaming Quezon for the messy politics we have today in the Philippines. But the thing is, most people miss the most important part, the second half of the quote, because Quezon also said, "Because however bad a Filipino government might be, we can always change it." Now Quezon negotiated Philippine independence through diplomacy, but he also brutally crushed a farmers' uprising. Quezon also saved over 1,000 Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, but he also displaced thousands of Muslims and indigenous communities in Mindanao. So who exactly was Manuel Luis Quezon? Was he a bayani, a hero who won our freedom, our independence? Or was he a villain, a politician who failed our people? Let's dig deeper and find out. Mabuhay, or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo. Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. Now, the new movie, Quezon, is finally out, at least in the Philippines. And I haven't seen it yet kasi it's not yet showing in the US until next week. So stay tuned for my movie review, which I'll be doing after I've seen it. But in today's video, since many of you requested, let's talk about who Quezon really was. In so many ways, for better or worse, Manuel Luis Quezon shaped the politics and the society of the Philippines today. But the thing is, his legacy is not black and white. If you're Filipino, then you've definitely heard the name Quezon. Quezon City, Quezon Province, Quezon Boulevard. His name is literally everywhere. But who was the person behind this iconic name? And why does he have an entire province and even the country's most populous city, the former capital, named after him? In today's video, we're not going to be able to resolve every contradiction about Quezon. Quezon is just far too complex for a single video like this. But don't worry, we'll dig into the deeper tensions that shaped both Quezon and the nation he built. We'll explore both the achievements and the controversies, both the good and the bad. So before Quezon became the boss of Philippine politics, he was just a little kid living in the provinces under colonial rule. So how exactly did a provincial boy from Tayabas ended up running everything? Manuel Luis Quezon y Molina was born August 19, 1878 in Baler in what is now Aurora Province. But actually back then, Baler was under the district of El Principe, which was then part of Nueva Ecija. Quezon came from a land-owning Spanish mestizo family, which then put him leagues ahead of most native Filipinos under colonial rule. Quezon's father was a school teacher who became a Spanish military officer, while his mother was from a prominent local family. Now, by the time Quezon was 17 or 18, he became involved in the 1896 Philippine Revolution, though historians today still debate what he actually did. But nevertheless, at one point, he became aide-de-camp to then-President Emilio Aguinaldo during the Philippine-American War. Now, Quezon studied law. He passed the bar, he became a lawyer, and eventually serving as provincial governor of Tayabas, or what is now Quezon Province, from 1906 to 1907. So Quezon, was building his political career within the new American colonial system. And the thing is, he was really good at it. Now, by 1907, Quezon realized that the Americans were not leaving anytime soon. So he chose a path that defined his entire political career, his entire life. Manuel Luis Quezon got elected to the first Philippine Assembly in 1907. Then he became the resident commissioner to the United States from 1909 to 1916, which means that he was the official Philippine representative in Washington, D.C. But then came his power move. Quezon was elected Senate President of the Philippines from 1916 to 1935. That is 19 years. Just think about it. The longest anyone has ever served in that position to this day. Now, Quezon, mastered the existing patronage politics that we actually inherited from the Spanish Padrino system, which was then, expanded and exploited by the American colonizers. So Quezon distributed government jobs, projects, and favors strategically for loyalty, creating loyal networks across the archipelago. People literally called him the boss of Philippine politics. So in short, Quezon played the colonial game better than anyone, even better than Emilio Aguinaldo. But the thing is, unlike the corrupted politicians we have today, Quezon did not get rich or amass wealth because of this. And in fact, there is no Quezon political dynasty today. But this system would later enable some of his most controversial decisions. Now, most colonies, had to fight decades of war, decades of revolution to regain their independence, to regain their freedom from the colonizers. So how exactly did Quezon pull this off, giving the Philippines full independence without waging another war? Manuel Luis Quezon spent years lobbying in Washington, D.C. going on, multiple independence missions throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. But between 1933 to 1934, his long-standing rivalry with Sergio Osmeña exploded over the Hair Horse Cutting Act, aka the first Philippine Independence Bill. Now, Quezon straight up rejected this bill, partly over provisions that he disagreed with, but mostly because his rivals, Sergio Osmeña and Manuel Rojas, got the credit. And so Quezon went back to Washington to negotiate his own version. And on March 24, 1934, the Tydings-McDuffie Act was signed. And this was, Quezon's version that was passed. And this created the Commonwealth of the Philippines, which is essentially a trial run at self-governance, a 10-year transition period where Filipinos would run their own government from within while still under American oversight, before the full independence on July 4, 1946. And thus, the Philippines became the very first Asian colony to negotiate peaceful independence through diplomacy. And so for many, this was Quezon's greatest achievement, winning freedom through diplomacy, not war. November 15, 1935, Manuel Luis Quezon becomes the first president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. Now he's got 10 years to literally build an entire nation from scratch while still under American rule. So how exactly did Quezon do it? Manuel Luis Quezon helped frame the 1935 Constitution. It is the same constitution that the Philippines was using until 1973. That's almost 40 years. And this established a presidential system with strong executive power. And Quezon was actually elected by massive popular mandate with his former rival, Sergio Osmeña, as his vice president. So as president of the Commonwealth, Quezon built government institutions that still exist today: a professionalized civil service system, economic development programs, infrastructure projects, public health initiatives, and the massive expansion of public education. So in short, the structure of the Philippine government today, a lot of that comes from Quezon's Commonwealth. And if you think about it, Quezon was creating the blueprint for an independent Philippines, and he was doing it within the limitations of being under American imperialism. And the thing is, Quezon could not have done any of this without Aurora, his brilliant, politically savvy, and beautiful wife, who was his closest advisor and partner throughout his career. She managed his public image, and she advocated for women's rights and education. She was the iconic first official First Lady of the Philippines. And even after Quezon's death, Aurora Quezon continued his legacy, and she became a key historical figure in her own right. In fact, the province of Aurora was named after her. Now, unlike others, Manuel Luis Quezon connected very well to the everyday Filipinos, to the ordinary people, in ways that previous leaders didn't. He was promising social justice, he was passing reforms, he was giving passionate speeches. So in short, he was saying and doing a lot of good things. So what actually happened and what actually changed for the masses? So the handsome Manuel Quezon gave speeches in Tagalog, not just in English or in Spanish. Quezon personally visited the provinces, connecting with the masses, and he was genuinely charismatic. Quezon understood mass politics, and he was seen as someone fighting for the interests of the Filipino people. He promised to help the masses, and he passed progressive legislation, better working conditions, labor rights protections, and the Rice Shared Tenancy Act for farmers. But the thing is, implementation was super weak because the landlords found loopholes to circumvent the law, and the elite-controlled institutions failed to enforce tenant protections. So this shows the limits of reformism within the colonial system, where the elites and the colonizers held the most power. So if you think about it, Quezon's intentions might have been genuine, but the system he operated within had built-in limitations and contradictions. So think about it. When building a new nation, everyone needs to communicate efficiently, right? One language to unite the entire country, the whole nation. But the thing is, which one do you pick? When people speak almost 200 languages across 7,000 islands. In 1936, Quezon created the National Language Institute, and in 1937, they selected Tagalog as the basis for the national language, which eventually became the Filipino language as we know it today. So the goal was simple: to unite the archipelago and create a national identity, which on paper, in theory, it sounds really great. But the thing is, there's a problem. The Philippines is home to over 100 languages, over 100 ethnicities. And in fact, during this time, Cebuano was actually the most spoken language, not Tagalog. But because of this policy, they got sidelined along with the rest. Ilocano, Waray, Hiligaynon, Kapampangan, Pangasinan, Maguindanaoan, Bicolano, and so many others all across the archipelago. People were told that their languages were provincial, or worse, that their languages were mere dialects. And I've actually made a series of videos about this topic, about this policy and its impact, about the languages of the Philippines. So check them out after this video. Filipino. But the point is, the message of the policy was clear. Manila decides while everybody else must adjust. And that has been the politics in the Philippines ever since. Now, to be fair, Manila had long been Spain's colonial capital for 300 years, and then America's colonial capital for decades. So this thing called Imperial Manila existed long before Quezon. So if you think about it, Quezon's language policy didn't create this Manila-centric politics. But the thing is, it reinforced centuries of Manila-centric policies. And the thing is, every nation-building project faces this kind of dilemma. You need a common language for unity. But any choice you make, especially in a place like the Philippines, where there's almost 200 languages, will always alienate someone. It was a difficult decision with no perfect answer. So in the end, Tagalog was elevated as a national language called Filipino. But instead of forging genuine national unity, this actually alienated other ethnicities, other languages in the Philippines, and only reinforced this resentment against Imperial Manila. Now here is something that most people forget. Manuel Luis Quezon championed women's right to vote at a time when most of the world still denied it. On April 30, 1937, Filipino women won the right to vote after a plebiscite passed with an overwhelming majority, around 90% of those who voted. And this made the Philippines one of the first countries in Asia to grant women's suffrage. In fact, even ahead of France, which didn't grant women's right to vote until 1944. Quezon actively supported and publicly championed this reform despite decades of societal resistance that claimed that women voting would destroy families and undermine male authority. So in short, Filipino women gained political rights long before many Western democracies. This was a genuine progressive achievement that expanded democracy, even if it existed within a colonial system. May 1935. Remember Quezon's promises about helping the poor. But the thing is, the farmers took him seriously. The farmers organized. The farmers rose up demanding land reform. So what exactly happened next? How did Quezon respond? On May 2nd to May 3rd, 1935, just months before the Commonwealth inauguration, there was a massive peasant rebellion in central and southern Luzon. It was known as the Sakdalista movement, led by Benigno Ramos. So tens of thousands of peasant farmers were involved, and they seized control of 14 towns with bolos and bamboo spears. These were tenant farmers, landless peasants, and the urban poor who faced crushing poverty under the colonial system. They saw the Commonwealth as just another colonial trick, and they wanted immediate independence, not a 10-year delay. They demanded land reform, tax relief, and they demanded an end to the colonial exploitation of the Filipino people. This was an organized resistance with a clear political program, not just random violence. They were fighting for survival and dignity. Now, to be fair, Quezon faced a real dilemma. The Commonwealth was fragile, independence was coming, and an armed uprising threatened stability. But the response was harsh. So Quezon promised to champion the masses, promised to champion social justice. But the thing is, when the masses organized, when the masses demanded justice, when they demanded real change, Quezon's government took a hardline stance against the movement, and the soldiers he sent crushed them brutally. The Philippine Constabulary was deployed with modern weapons. They crushed the rebellion brutally in one day. It was bolos and bamboo spears versus rifles and machine guns. So the outcome was never in doubt. Then, just months later, Quezon was inaugurated as the social justice president who promised to help the masses. But the thing is, when the masses actually rebelled and demanded change, they instead got bullets. This shows whose interests the Commonwealth really served. When the poor demanded change, they got deadly force. But when elites negotiated, they got government positions. And this shows the limits of elite-led reform. Now, don't get me wrong, Quezon genuinely believed in social justice. But the thing is, when push came to shove, the system he led, the system itself, defended elite interest. It is a tension that many reformers face throughout history. And this pattern of elites crushing poor people's movements would repeat throughout Philippine history. Sadly, this was not the first time, and it definitely wasn't the last. So Quezon was trying, to solve inequality. Farmers in Luzon and the Visayas, they have no land of their own. They were facing starvation and poverty, while at the same time, Mindanao has plenty of land and abundant resources. So Quezon created a program to solve this problem. But the thing is, on paper, it sounds like the perfect plan. But in reality, it was more like the perfect storm. In 1939, Quezon created the National Land Settlement Administration, and this policy built on earlier American settlement programs from the 1910s to the 1920s. And the idea was to move landless Christian Filipinos from Luzon and the Visayas to Mindanao to quote-unquote develop the region and help the poor. But the problem is, indigenous communities, both Muslims and Lumads, had been living in Mindanao for centuries, if not for thousands of years. And the government declared that their land became public domain, a legal fiction, and completely ignored traditional ownership. There was no consultation, no compensation. Ancestral lands were just given to Christian settlers. But the thing is, the government knew that these lands were occupied. So this was not accidental or out of ignorance. It was an official policy. And again, it wasn't just indigenous Lumad lands. Muslim sultanates like Sulu and Maguindanao had governed these territories for centuries with their own political systems. But in 1937, Quezon also issued an executive order recognizing the Sultan of Sulu only as a ceremonial figure, quietly ending centuries of political sovereignty. And so in places like Sulu and Mindanao, self-governance was replaced with Manila-appointed officials, and traditional laws were sidelined in favor of Manila-centric policies. So if you think about it, it is the same old colonial playbook. If the people are not Christian, then pretend nobody lives there. Call it empty land. Then take it. It is a dirty trick that, a legal fiction that has been used to erase indigenous peoples all over the world. The same dirty trick that colonizers use everywhere to displace indigenous people and steal their land. So what exactly happened to the Muslims and the indigenous Lumads who had been living in Mindanao for centuries, if not for thousands of years? The demographic shift is staggering. If you look at the numbers, in 1903, Muslims made up 76% of Mindanao's population. Now, during Quezon's Commonwealth Era, their resettlement program began this dramatic demographic shift, and by 1939, Muslims had already decreased to just 34% of the population. But after World War II, and after Quezon's death, the migration exploded even more. Between 1948 and 1960, more than 1.2 million Christian Filipinos migrated to Mindanao, faster than the entire American colonial period. Now fast forward to the 2020 census. Mindanao is now 65% Christian, 30% Muslim, and 5% other religions, including the indigenous. That is a complete demographic reversal from 100 years ago. And the thing is, it wasn't just Christian Filipinos getting land. The government also gave vast tracts of land to American corporations for massive plantations growing rubber, pineapples, and bananas. So if you think about it, the indigenous peoples and the Muslim communities in Mindanao lost their ancestral lands twice, once to Christian settlers and again to foreign-owned agribusinesses. Business operations turning huge profits, while the original landowners became low-wage workers on the land that used to be theirs. Or worse, they became homeless, landless, displaced, and facing crushing poverty. And so by the 1970s, this turned violent. Armed groups in Mindanao started fighting back. And since then, we've had decades of bloody conflict, decades of violence that directly trace back to these settlement policies, with an estimated 120 to 150,000 deaths. So when you hear about the Mindanao conflict today, the insurgencies, the instabilities, the peace talks, this is where it all started. And the thing is, the conflict continues to impact millions of people today. 1938, millions of Jews were fleeing Nazi Germany. Millions of Jews were fleeing the Holocaust in Europe. Millions of people were fleeing genocide. But what does the world do? They closed their doors. America, Britain, Canada, and so many others, they all said no. Except for one place, the Philippines. From 1937 to 1941, Manuel Quezon implemented an open-door policy for Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution, and over 1,000 Jewish refugees found safety in Manila when most countries, including the US, Canada, and most of Europe, were closing their doors. So Quezon actively and personally pushed for this policy, despite opposition at home and despite restrictions from the Americans. Quezon directly worked with Jewish refugee organizations, and he even planned a large agricultural settlement in Mindanao capable of taking in 10,000 refugees. But World War II and the Japanese invasion of the Philippines cut the program short. This was real moral courage. Quezon took risks to save lives, even when the rest of the world turned away. Descendants of these families still honor this history to this day, and many of them remain connected to the Philippines. So if you think about it, this is one of the clearest examples of Quezon using his power for genuine good. So the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines had one clear rule built in to prevent dictatorships. One term, no re-election, clean and simple, right? Well, Quezon found a way around it. The 1935 Philippine Constitution specifically said 1 6-year term with no re-election, and the framers wanted to prevent dictatorship. But in 1939 to 1940, Manuel Quezon pushed to change it, and by June 1940, the amendments passed. So this changed the presidential term limits, from 1 6-year term to 4-year terms with 1 re-election allowed. So it was legal but questionable. So if you think about it, Quezon broke the spirit of the original constitution. And you could argue that dangerous times with World War II raging might need experienced leadership staying longer. But here's the thing, regardless of Quezon's intentions, this move set a dangerous precedent. In fact, this playbook would be used again by later presidents trying to stay in power, looking for loopholes or even changing the entire constitution to stay in power. December 8, 1941, just mere hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japan attacks the Philippines, and everything that Quezon built was about to be destroyed. On December 8, 1941, Japan invaded the Philippines, and Manila fell quickly. Quezon and the government retreated to the island fortress of Corregidor, where they held out for months under brutal siege. And in February of 1942, as Corregidor was about to fall, Quezon was evacuated by an American submarine to Australia, and then he established a government in exile in Washington, D.C. So while the Philippines was suffering under brutal Japanese occupation, Quezon continued lobbying for Philippine interests throughout the war. But sadly, on August 1st, 1944, Manuel Luis Quezon passed away. Quezon died of tuberculosis at the age of 65 in Saranac Lake, New York. He never saw Philippine independence on July 4th, 1946. He died almost 2 years before his greatest achievement was realized. Manuel Luis Quezon was given a state funeral with full military honors, a rare recognition for a foreign leader in the US, and he was buried temporarily in Virginia at the Arlington National Cemetery before being moved to Manila after the war. And in fact, today, you can visit the remains of Manuel Quezon and his beloved wife, Aurora Aragon Quezon, at the Quezon Memorial Shrine in Quezon City, at the base of this iconic monument and museum dedicated to Quezon. So who exactly was Manuel Luis Quezon? Now, to be honest, no video, no movie, no documentary, not even books can fully capture who Quezon really was. But let us remember his most famous quote: "I prefer a government run like hell by Filipinos than a government run like heaven by Americans. Because however bad a Filipino government might be, we can always change it." And understanding this, that is actually the key in understanding Quezon. Manuel Luis Quezon believed that we could govern ourselves, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, and fix them. Quezon negotiated independence through diplomacy. He built institutions that outlived him, that lasted for decades. He showed moral courage when the world turned away from the Jewish refugees. Quezon believed in democracy enough to put limits on his own powers. But then, he also crushed peasant uprisings brutally. He displaced indigenous peoples. He took advantage of the patronage politics to stay in power. But the thing is, nation building is messy, and our leaders are human. Our bayanis are human, capable of both vision and blind spots. Now here's what matters. Quezon believed in our democracy. Quezon believed in our capacity for change. And that belief is actually empowering because it means that we have the agency. It means that we can learn from what worked and what didn't, and make better choices. Now look, Quezon lived in a time when empires ruled the world, and his choices were controversial. Was he perfect? Hell no. Did he make mistakes? Absolutely. But the thing is, Quezon gave us something to work with. Regardless of his intentions or ambitions, Quezon left us with a foundation we can actually improve on. So maybe the real question is not about whether Quezon was a hero or a villain, but all about freedom and empowerment. Are we actually using that freedom? Are we actually changing what needs changing? Or are we just repeating the same patterns, the same mistakes? Just think about it. Are we actually taking action to protect the freedom that our bayanis fought for and died for? Or are we just taking it for granted? Now I'll be reviewing the movie Quezon after I watched it. So stay tuned for that review in the coming days. But for now, let me know what you think about Quezon, about this topic in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about Quezon, my friend and fellow historian Alvin Campamones wrote the official teaching and study guide for the movie Quezon. Actually, Alvin wrote the study guide for the entire Bayaniverse trilogy since General Luna to Goyo to Quezon. So check them out in the links below to learn more. And shout out to my friend Alvin. And if you want to dive deeper into our people's rich history, colorful cultures, and everything in between, I've actually made hundreds of videos on this channel. And I've also written several books uplifting the narratives of our people. So check them out in the links below. Maraming salamat po o Kamampangan, dakal pong salamat kay Kongan, and in bahasa sug magsukol tuod kay mo. See you next time or in Tagalog kita kits and Kamampangan, Mikitix and Binisaya, kita ita.